Right now, somewhere in Australia, a perfectly healthy looking ute is sitting in a dealership service bay with a repair quote on the windscreen that is larger than most Australians' monthly mortgage repayments. The owner bought it new, serviced it on time, and did absolutely nothing wrong, but the moment that odometer ticked past 100,000 kilometres, the engine decided it was done pretending. Today, we are exposing the 10 engines that are quietly destroying the financial lives of everyday Australian drivers the moment the warranty card expires. Number 10, the Volkswagen 3.0 litre V6 TDI. Found in the Touareg and the Amarok V6, this engine arrived in Australia wrapped in European prestige and genuine performance credentials, and for the first 100,000 kilometres, it largely delivers on that promise. It pulls hard, it feels refined, and it makes the other utes at the servo look a little ordinary by comparison. Then the warranty expires, and the engine reveals its true personality. The camshaft sprocket on the 3-litre V6 TDI has a documented tendency to fracture, not wear, not gradually degrade, fracture, spontaneously, without warning, without a single light on the dashboard to give you a heads up. When that sprocket lets go at highway speed, the timing relationship between the camshaft and the crankshaft is destroyed in a fraction of a second. Valves meet pistons, pistons lose, the engine destroys itself from the inside out faster than you can lift your foot off the accelerator. Volkswagen quietly issued technical service bulletins acknowledging the issue. But if you are out of warranty, that bulletin is cold comfort when the tow truck is backing up to your Amarok on the side of the Bruce Highway. Beyond the sprocket, the high-pressure fuel injection system on this engine operates at pressures that would make your garden hose weep. It is extraordinarily sensitive to fuel quality. And if you have ever filled up at a remote roadhouse in regional Queensland or outback Western Australia, you already know that fuel quality is not always the first priority. Injector replacements on this engine run 4,000 to 7,000 Australian dollars. Parts are European sourced. Wait times in remote areas can stretch to weeks. One bloke I spoke to in the Pilbara drove his Touareg in for a routine service and drove out in a loan car for 11 days while they waited for parts on a boat from Stuttgart. For a car he paid $90,000 for. Number 9, the Mitsubishi 2.4 litre Emiveq diesel, engine code 4N15. This engine lives in the current generation Triton, the QE series from 2015 onwards, and it has built itself a reputation in Australian workshops that Mitsubishi's marketing department would prefer did not exist. Let us start with the EGR system. The 4N15 fouls its EGR valve with a commitment and enthusiasm that is almost impressive. By 80,000 kilometres, the carbon buildup on high-use vehicles, particularly those doing regular towing in hilly terrain, is severe enough to push the engine into limp mode. An EGR clean will run you $800 to $1,500. A cracked EGR cooler means a full replacement, and that invoice is going to hurt considerably more. But the EGR is not the main event. The main event is the timing chain. Between 100,000 and 160,000 kilometres, the timing chain on the 4N15 begins to stretch. The tell is a rattle on cold starts that disappears once the engine warms up. It sounds almost harmless. Owners hear it for months, assume it is just a quirk, and keep driving. By the time they arrive in the workshop, that stretched chain has caused timing deviation. In interference engines, timing deviation means valves and pistons having an argument. The valves always lose. Cylinder head damage on top of a timing chain replacement turns a $3,500 job into an $8,000 to $11,000 catastrophe. I have seen this exact scenario play out more times than I care to count. A young family buys a used QE Triton privately at 95,000 kilometres, Cold start, rattle already present but dismissed by the seller as normal. 6 weeks later, the engine is on the bench and the repair quote is $5,000. The private seller, I strongly suspect, understood exactly what that rattle meant. Number 8. The Ford 2.0 litre bi-turbo EcoBlue, the Lion diesel. This is the engine Ford decided to put in Australia's best-selling vehicle. Think about that for a moment. Australia's best-selling vehicle, powered by a 2-litre 4-cylinder with twin turbochargers, trying to move a 2.5-ton truck and whatever you have decided to bolt onto it. The engineering logic requires a certain amount of optimism to appreciate. To be fair to Ford, the Lion diesel in the PX3 Ranger and Everest is genuinely clever engineering. The sequential twin-turbo system produces impressive torque figures on paper, and it genuinely feels strong under normal conditions. The problem is that Australian conditions are not normal conditions. Sustained highway towing in 40-degree heat, corrugated outback tracks, repeated long-distance runs, fully loaded. Under these conditions, the twin-turbo system operates under thermal stress that the European laboratory testing that signed off on this engine never fully accounted for. Turbo failures on the bi-turbo Lion diesel have been logged between 80,000 and 140,000 kilometres, with replacement costs landing between $5,000 and $8,000. The intercooler hose connections are another known weakness. Under sustained high-boost towing loads, the pressure surges inside the intercooler system can split the hose connections. When that happens, you lose boost pressure instantly and the engine goes into protection mode. A mining contractor I know, working outside Karratha, had both turbos fail and an intercooler hose split in the same 12-month period, all after 100,000 kilometres, all after the warranty had expired. Total bill, just over $12,000. He is now driving a 76 Series Land Cruiser and has never looked calmer. The DPF on this engine also struggles with suburban duty cycles, short trips, repeated cold starts, stop-start traffic. The regeneration cycles cannot complete, the filter blocks, and the engine goes into limp mode at the worst possible moment. Number 7. The Nissan 2.3 litre twin turbo diesel, engine code M9R, Navara D23. We need to talk about the D23 Navara. And I want to be upfront about something before we do. This is not the worst engine on this list, not even close, but it might be the most disappointing. And in the Australian ute market, disappointment has a price tag. When Nissan launched the D23 Navara in Australia, the marketing campaign was aggressive and confident. Here was a modern, sophisticated, properly engineered alternative to the Hilux dominance that had gone largely unchallenged for years. The M9R twin turbo diesel looked strong on paper, torque figures that competed, power outputs that impressed, a completely redesigned independent rear suspension that Nissan positioned as a genuine revolution in ride quality and handling dynamics for the segment, and standing in the showroom behind the wheel with the leather trim and the modern infotainment system and the confident salesman explaining the towing capacity, it genuinely felt like Nissan had done it, like they had finally built the truck that could go toe-to-toe with the Hilux and actually win. Then people drove them in Australia, actually drove them on corrugated outback tracks, on Queensland's notoriously rough regional roads, with a loaded trailer on the back, the way working Australians actually use a ute. That independent rear suspension, the feature Nissan had marketed as a breakthrough, began introducing stress fractures into the rear chassis and suspension mounting points under sustained towing loads on corrugated surfaces. This was not a rumor from a forum. Nissan issued multiple official technical service bulletins acknowledging the problem. They extended warranty coverage specifically in response to the volume of complaints coming in from owners. Chassis repairs in serious cases landed between $5,000 and $15,000. On a vehicle people bought as a reliable workhorse, that is not an acceptable surprise. But the chassis is honestly only half the story. The M9R engine itself carries its own set of problems that become expensive after 100,000 kilometers. The engine runs tight modern machining tolerances and requires the thin, low viscosity oils that modern emissions era engines specify. Under normal conditions, this is manageable, but when the DPF regeneration cycle fails to complete and on D23s used in suburban stop-start driving conditions, incomplete regenerations are common, raw diesel gets injected into the combustion chamber and does not fully burn, that unburned diesel washes past the piston rings and migrates directly into the engine oil in the sump. Oil dilution, thin oil, made thinner by raw diesel contamination running through bearing clearances already engineered to microscopic tolerances. It is a death sentence written in slow motion across the engine internals. Crankshaft bearing wear on high mileage towing examples is documented, serious, and expensive. Here is the most honest proof that the broader market has already done this math. Search D23 Navara on any Australian used car platform right now. Look at the volume of examples listed the moment the factory warranty window closes. Those are not bargains. Those are owners who understood exactly what was coming next. Number 6, the Toyota 2.8 litre diesel, engine code 1GD FTV. I know. Putting a Toyota engine on this list feels like accusing a golden retriever of being dangerous, but here's the thing about truth: it does not care about brand loyalty. The 1GD FTV in the current Hilux, Fortuner and Prado is, under normal use, a genuinely strong engine. Toyota engineered it with conservative tuning, a forged steel crankshaft, and enough mechanical headroom that properly maintained examples are running past 300,000 kilometers without drama. But Toyota was dragged through federal court in a massive class action involving more than 260,000 vehicles over defective DPF systems. Owners reported foul white smoke, plunging fuel economy, and severe engine degradation. When the brand that built its entire global identity on bulletproof reliability is paying out millions over DPF failures, the entire industry needs to pay attention. The dusting issue is equally serious. On certain production runs of the 1GD FTV, the air intake system has demonstrated an ability to allow fine dust to bypass the air filter under sustained outback conditions. Fine dust entering a diesel combustion chamber at high speed is abrasive at a microscopic level that is difficult to overstate. It accelerates bore wear, piston ring wear, and ultimately leads to compression loss and injector degradation in a way that presents initially as poor fuel economy before graduating to engine failure. Injector failures on the 1GD are the third pillar of this problem. Common rail injector replacement on this platform runs $3,000 to $6,000 depending on how many injectors are affected and whether the failure has caused downstream combustion damage. Pre-2018 examples also have documented timing chain and water pump issues. Fixed properly on a used example, the job runs $2,500 to $3,500, manageable but not a surprise you want on top of an injector bill. Number 5, the Hyundai and Kia 2.2 litre CRDI engine code D4HB. This engine appears in the Santa Fe, the Sorento and the Staria, and it represents something genuinely interesting in the Australian market because Hyundai and Kia have spent an enormous amount of money and effort convincing Australian buyers that Korean engineering is now on equal footing with Japanese reliability, and in many respects they have made a compelling case. The D4HB is, for the first 100,000 kilometers, a reasonably strong diesel. It pulls well, returns decent economy, and the vehicles it powers are genuinely comfortable and well equipped. After 100,000 kilometers, it starts a conversation you do not want to have. The timing chain tensioner on the D4HB has a documented failure mode that Australian mechanics are becoming uncomfortably familiar with. When the tensioner weakens, chain slack develops. Chain slack on an interference engine leads to the same grim outcome we discussed with the Mitsubishi. Valves and pistons do not coexist peacefully when timing is compromised. The intake valves on this engine, and this applies particularly to earlier D4HB variants, accumulate carbon deposits at a rate that is genuinely impressive in the worst possible way. Because the D4HB uses direct injection, the fuel spray never washes the back of the intake valves the way port injection does. Carbon bakes onto the valve stems and valve seats over time, restricting airflow and eventually causing misfires, rough idle, and power loss. Walnut blasting the intake valves, the accepted solution, runs $1,500 to $2,500 in labor alone, and then there is the dealer network reality, parts availability, and technician familiarity with the D4HB outside major metropolitan areas in Australia remains patchy. If this engine develops a serious fault in regional Queensland or outback South Australia, you may be waiting a very long time for resolution. Number 4. The Land Rover and Jaguar 3.0 litre SDV6, found in the Defender, the Discovery and various Range Rover variants. This engine is proof that engineering brilliance and engineering reliability are not the same thing, and I say this with genuine respect for the achievement. The SDV6 is a sophisticated, compact, powerful diesel that does extraordinary things in a small package. It is also a financial black hole that has consumed the savings of more Australian four-wheel drive enthusiasts than I care to think about. The SDV6 suffers from what I can only describe as an unholy trinity of failure modes. The EGR system, the DPF system, and the timing chain, 3 separate systems, each capable of delivering a serious repair bill independently. In practice, they often arrive together because the failures are interconnected in ways that make the total invoice genuinely breathtaking. The EGR cooler on the SDV6 cracks internally with a reliability that borders on impressive. When it does, coolant enters the intake. Coolant in a diesel intake manifold leads to hydrolocking. A hydrolocked diesel engine can bend connecting rods. Bent connecting rods are an engine replacement conversation. An engine replacement on a Land Rover is a discussion that typically starts at $15,000 and climbs from there. The timing chain on the SDV6 requires replacement at intervals that Land Rover does not prominently advertise. When it stretches, and it will stretch, you are looking at a labor-intensive job on an engine designed with the spatial efficiency of a Swiss watch. Getting to the timing chain on this engine is most of the job. Parts? The parts. Genuine Land Rover parts for the SDV6 in Australia arrive with price tags that suggest they have been individually carved from the bones of endangered species and shipped here by private jet. Number 3, the GM 6.0 litre V8 diesel, the LLY and LBZ variants. Some of you are already typing in the comments. I can feel it. Something along the lines of, mate, that is an American engine. What has it got to do with Australian utes? And it is a completely fair challenge. Bear with me for 30 seconds because the answer matters. Grey imports have been quietly reshaping the Australian used truck market for the better part of a decade. American spec heavy-duty pickups, ex-fleet work trucks, and commercial vehicles originally built for the North American market have found their way onto Australian roads, into Australian farm operations, and into Australian mining contractor fleets in growing numbers. Beyond the grey import pipeline, the GM 6-litre V8 diesel also found its way into certain Colorado variants and commercial truck configurations that reached Australian shores through official channels. The result is that this engine has accumulated enough of an Australian workshop presence to earn its place on this list. If it was still purely a theoretical import curiosity, we would not be talking about it. We are talking about it because Australian mechanics are seeing it, and what they are seeing is not encouraging. The 6-litre GM diesel has a reputation in North American automotive circles that precedes it dramatically, famous the way a villain in a documentary is famous. The name is universally recognized, the stories are widely circulated, and the punchline is always the same, the EGR cooler. The factory exhaust gas recirculation cooler on the GM 6-litre diesel was not designed with sufficient thermal robustness for the heat loads this engine generates under sustained heavy-duty use. That is the polite version. The less polite version is that the cooler cracks, and it cracks with a consistency that suggests the engineers may have been optimistic about what their design could actually survive. When the EGR cooler cracks internally, coolant escapes into the exhaust gas circuit. That coolant then finds its way into the combustion chambers. Coolant in a diesel combustion chamber triggers hydrolocking. Hydrolocking bends connecting rods, and a 6-litre V8 diesel with bent connecting rods is not a repair conversation. It is an engine replacement conversation, and those conversations in this displacement class start at figures that will genuinely upset you. In the United States, this engine generated formal class action litigation, manufacturer extended warranty programs, and a volume of documented owner complaints that kept lawyers busy for years. The aftermarket responded by developing an EGR cooler delete and upgrade kit that is substantially more thermally capable than the factory unit. That kit works, but you are paying for it on top of whatever damage the original cooler failure caused, which means you are already behind financially before the improved solution is even installed. In Australian applications, this engine is regularly found in exactly the working conditions that stress the cooling system most severely: sustained towing, heavy commercial loads, long-distance runs in high ambient temperatures, the kind of duty cycles that expose every weakness in a cooling system design. The EGR cooler failure on this engine is not a theoretical risk you weigh up and decide to accept. It is a documented, predictable, time-sensitive event. In Australian conditions, the question is not whether it will happen. The question is how many kilometers away you are from when it does. Number 2, the VM Motori 3.0 litre diesel engine code EXL, Jeep Grand Cherokee and Ram 1500. The VM Motori diesel. If you have not heard of it by name, you may have heard of it by reputation. Specifically, the reputation it earned in the Jeep, Grand Cherokee, and certain Ram variants that made it to Australian shores through official channels and grey import networks. VM Motori is an Italian engine manufacturer. Italy builds extraordinary things: fashion, architecture, food that will make you question every meal you have eaten previously, diesel engines for large American SUVs designed to operate reliably in Australian outback conditions. One of these things is not like the others. The EXL variant of this engine has a documented oil cooler failure mode. The oil cooler cracks internally, allowing engine oil and coolant to mix. Mixed oil and coolant is a combination with only one destination, and that destination is catastrophic engine damage. In severe cases, cracked pistons have been reported. Cracked pistons in a 3-litre diesel are not a repair, they are an engine replacement event. The global class action litigation triggered by failures of this engine in Jeep Grand Cherokee applications is a matter of public record. Settlements were reached, replacement programs were implemented, but if you are buying a used Grand Cherokee or a grey import Ram with this engine, and you do not know the history of what has been done to address these issues, you are walking into a situation with significant financial exposure. Parts availability for the VM Motori in Australia is its own separate challenge. This is not a Toyota. The dealer network is limited. The independent specialists who genuinely understand this engine can be counted on one hand in most Australian states. When something goes wrong, and based on the evidence, something will go wrong, the combination of parts scarcity, specialist labour rates, and the fundamental cost of the repair itself produces invoices that have genuinely shocked people. Number 1. The Nissan 3.0 litre ZD30 DDTI. Here we are. If you have spent any time in Australian four-wheel drive circles, in any shed, any forum, any campfire conversation between people who actually use their trucks. You already knew this was coming. The ZD30. The engine that earned a nickname so perfectly descriptive that it requires no further explanation, the grenade. The ZD30 was fitted to the Nissan Patrol, GU and Y61 series through the late 1990s and 2000s. On paper, a 3-litre turbocharged diesel in a vehicle as capable and well regarded as the Patrol should have been a triumph. The Patrol platform itself is legendary. The chassis, the transfer case, the differentials, the body-on-frame construction, all of it is genuinely excellent. Nissan then fitted it with an engine that in certain configurations had a measurable tendency to destroy itself. The failure modes of the ZD30 are so well documented in Australia that they have achieved a kind of dark folklore status. Overboosting was the primary killer in early variants. The variable nozzle turbocharger would stick, boost pressure would climb past safe limits, and the engine would catastrophically fail under the excess cylinder pressure. We are talking about connecting rods exiting the engine block. We are talking about holes in the side of the engine, physical holes. This is not a turn of phrase, this is a mechanical event that has happened to Australian Patrol owners on remote tracks far from any assistance. The intercooler on early ZD30 variants was undersized. The EGR system contributed to carbon buildup and accelerated wear. The pistons in early variants were not sufficiently robust for the thermal loads the engine generated. Nissan revised the engine multiple times through its production run. Later variants, particularly post-2007 examples, with the updated ECU calibration and improved intercooler, are considerably more reliable. The aftermarket has also developed turbo inlet kits, catch cans, and EGR solutions that address the primary failure modes effectively, but here is the thing. The ZD30 is number one on this list, not simply because of how badly it can fail. Several engines on this list fail just as expensively. The ZD30 is number one because of the gap between expectation and reality. People buy a Nissan Patrol, the Patrol. A vehicle synonymous with indestructibility in the Australian consciousness. They buy it and they are handed an engine that in early form had a statistically uncomfortable relationship with its own structural integrity. The good news, if you can call it that, is that the Australian four-wheel drive community has accumulated decades of ZD30 knowledge. The failure modes are understood, the preventative modifications are well documented and relatively affordable. A ZD30 Patrol that has been properly sorted, with the boost fixed, the catch confitted, the EGR addressed and the cooling system maintained, is a very different proposition to a neglected stock example. But if you are buying a used ZD30 Patrol, and you do not know its exact history, you are not buying a bargain, you are buying a mystery box. And in the history of Australian motoring, this particular mystery box has contained some very unpleasant surprises. So there they are, 10 engines that have collectively produced more large and unexpected repair invoices than perhaps any other group of power plants in the history of the Australian used vehicle market. And here's the thing I want to leave you with. None of these engines were designed by stupid people. The engineers who built the ZD30, the SDV6, the Lion Diesel, the VM Motori, these are intelligent, highly trained professionals working within systems that prioritized emissions compliance, fuel economy targets, and manufacturing cost efficiency above long-term mechanical robustness. They were not trying to build you a financial trap, but the cumulative result of those priorities in real-world Australian conditions, with real-world Australian driving cycles, produced exactly that. Your defense is knowledge. Get a pre-purchase inspection from an independent specialist before you buy anything on this list in the used market. Cut your oil change intervals aggressively on any modern diesel. Fit a quality catch can. Install a secondary fuel filter if you venture beyond sealed roads, and understand the specific failure modes of whatever engine sits under your bonnet before it introduces itself to you on the side of a remote highway. The drivers who avoid the catastrophic bills are not the ones who bought the right brand, they are the ones who bought with their eyes open. If this video has just saved you from signing away your financial future on an engine with a history you are not aware of, hit the subscribe button right now. Drop your engine horror story in the comments below. The Australian motoring community is built on shared knowledge and hard-won experience, and every story you share down there is the story that saves someone else from the same mistake. I will see you in the next one.